It's a long-standing opinion on this channel that Kirby is not living up to its full potential on Switch. Even as we mentioned in last week's video, the series' mainline Switch entry, Kirby Star Allies, has the likely effect of not making potential newcomers to the franchise think, I see the potential here, but the game just isn't doing it justice, but instead to think that the franchise as a whole isn't for them and doesn't have potential. But potential it has. In a post-Breath of the Wild world that flipped Zelda tradition on its head, and one with a huge Metroid resurgence around the corner, just to mention a few, there is a world of potential for the Kirby series for Nintendo to tap into, and there's a chance that they are. Let's talk about it. First things first, I should mention that I'm not a huge Kirby fan. I certainly don't dislike the franchise. My introduction to it was on my Game Boy Color with Kirby's Dream Land 2, and while I haven't stuck closely with the series since then, I've dipped my toes back in here and there and generally had a good time. But this video is less about me trying to acquiesce to what Kirby is and has been for generations, and more taking what's great about this little pink gentleman and extending it to its logical gameplay limits and ultimate potential. You're going to hear that word potential a lot, as I realize now that I've finished writing the script. And frankly, it seems that Kirby's developers, HAL Laboratories, themselves may want the same thing. As I said to begin with, let's take Breath of the Wild. With that game, they took tradition, scrapped it, and asked themselves from the ground up, what does it mean to be a Zelda game, and went from there. From that, we got this puzzle-infused, exploration-heavy, slightly less narrative-driven open-world game that I love more than pizza. As in, I love it more than pizza loves it. I can't compare my love for my favorite game and tasty food. Can you do that? Let me know in the comments. So what? Am I saying make Kirby open world, or even put Kirby in a world just like Breath of the Wild and call it a day? Of course not. When we at fanatixfour talk about the Breath of the Wild treatment, it's about a mindset and a process, not an end result. It's about rethinking the status quo, even if the status quo is doing well, and building it back up from the foundation. Zelda games were doing pretty well for a franchise, but with a complete overhaul, now the new title has outsold any 2, maybe even 3 other Zeldas combined. And Kirby is vastly less successful than the traditional Zelda, usually selling 1 to 3 million range rather than Zelda's average 5 to 8. So there's even that much more potential there. The irony is, I think the logical conclusion of Kirby happens to look a lot more like traditional Zeldas than you may have guessed. Let's get into it. Firstly, what are the key elements of Kirby? I think first of all is the design. Kirby himself is basically no wiggle room as a character. He's arguably more consistent than Mario. Spherical, briefly white, pink shortly thereafter, and yep, that's Kirby. From inception to date, he doesn't need a ground-up overhaul for Dark Souls Kirby, he's just Kirby. And going further out, I think the world art direction can stay largely the same as the latest entries. For as unimpressed with elements of Star Allies as I was, at least I think the game looked nice and is absolutely the kind of property to benefit from a bubblegum plasticky feel in the best way. Obviously, all this applies out to the characters and enemies as well. They are iconic and fun and core to Kirby's identity. Now, leaning into the gameplay side are the 3 elements that I think make up the core of a Kirby game. In increasing importance of order, number 1, hand-to-hand combat, floating, and finally, sucking up enemies / copying their abilities. These are what we're going to base this whole game around. I say them in this order because if we start thinking of a Kirby spin-off, for example, you'd need an okay reason to take away hand-to-hand combat, but you'd need a pretty good reason to take away floating, and it could almost not feel like the same property without some variety of copy abilities. Basically, at that point, it's got to be Kirby Tetris or something, and even then, I would hope it would make the reference of the copy abilities in some way. So, copy abilities are the core of the game. Always have been, always should be. Let's start there. One way that Kirby has always fallen just a little short of his potential is in how the copy abilities are used. Sure, there are levels and sections of levels that rely on a specific ability to progress. Maybe there's a rope that needs to be cut with a sword, and there's Sword Knight nearby to suck up and use his sword, or a bomb wick that needs to be lit, and a burning Leo's nearby. But usually it's just a small progression puzzle, and the solution isn't really how to use that ability, it's just to realize that you need to use that ability and then go suck up the enemy and just do it. How often though, and I'm really asking because I actually haven't played every game, so this may be done a little bit better sometimes than others, but how often does the game really require you to have good knowledge of each ability and use the mechanics in situations with increasing complexity? My experience tells me rarely, but this is exactly what I want to see and to be the core gameplay principle. Imagine with me Dreamland as we know and love it, but in 3D. At which point, it might a bit more closely resemble the Hyrule of traditional Zeldas, being somewhat segmented but in a way that feels vast and full of wonder. And let me stop here and give some reasoning real quick. I'm sure that half of all the Kirby fans would give a huge sigh of relief that although they love every single game in the franchise history, they're finally trying something new this way. Not to say it couldn't tuck tail and run back as soon as the next entry, but for one game, this is something new and ambitious. Conversely, on the other half of the Kirby fanbase, they're probably mad at the idea of change, just like a ton of us are, just like lots of people were mad about weapon durability or lack of dungeons or a fully fleshed out sword in Breath of the Wild. It's understandable, but I think in addition to it being hopefully likely based off of comments from the dev team, I think it may be necessary for the franchise, especially after Kirby Star Allies, which existed almost entirely to appease the pre-existing fanbase as a celebration and end cap to where they'd come. It turned off just about every potential new fan that I've ever talked to in my small sample size of anecdotal evidence. The series would really benefit from rethinking itself, even if just for a little while. And entirely selfishly, I would love to play a brand new Kirby game and think that it's fun. Simple as that. So, 3D Dreamland. Maybe this could be some kind of origin story because of the mechanics I'm about to recommend. For a long time though, I'd thought that a 3D Kirby would be impossible to make good for one main reason, and that's floating, or flying, or whatever. Its detriment was that on one hand, floating isn't a particularly fun way of traversal. It's sluggish and not really that interesting. But on the other hand, it's also kind of OP. If traversal is the challenge, which in action platformer type games it often is, why would a player not just fly over everything? Which would both make the game less fun because you're not engaging with the designed world and obstacles, but also, as we just said, floating isn't even fun, so this would break the game in the most boring way. But every problem has a solution. So to fix the second problem first, Kirby's fluency at floating is earned. Basically, you'd have some kind of stamina type system where throughout the game you can inhale more air and therefore float higher and longer, and the game's built around this. There may be areas with collectibles or treasures early on that are out of reach until you gain an extra float. And to fix the problem of it being boring or having bad momentum, on one hand, it can be de-incentivized from being your means of transportation by not being so fun, whereas running would be faster and more entertaining, so floating would get relegated to more progression than transportation. But finally, for floating, two improvements that come throughout the game. A, your floating speed is momentum-based, so if you run and then jump off a ledge, you retain forward momentum in a way that running and floating combination is actually really entertaining, just like the bomb flying in Breath of the Wild. But also, halfway through the game, you gain Kirby's star ability to fly around Kirby Air Ride style. It shouldn't be usable everywhere, but it especially makes return traversal a lot more fun, like a horse in Zelda or riding a Pokemon in Pokemon, and so on. And this is why it would be something of an origin story, since Kirby can float way better in other games, so this is about him gaining that power. Also, with the additional air for floating logic comes combat progression. Kirby's able to suck up enemies, obviously, but what if this were a Katamari Damacy kind of a thing? Early on, he's only able to suck up certain sizes of enemies because, in universe, they're just too big for him yet. But game design-wise, this blocks off some abilities for when they're able to be used at the right time without feeling heavy-handed. But what about that gameplay progression? Well, I mentioned the copy abilities, and as I said, that's going to be the core of what we're going for here. I think sucking up enemies and using their powers is absolutely important. However, I think that being the only way you can use their powers is a limiting factor to how effectively the powers can be used. Like I said, right now, the game is basically designed so that it's players' choice on how they want to use these powers, and when a specific one is needed, it's only very minimally. But I think, like with the bomb flowers in Ocarina of Time or Skyward Sword, a lot of these powers should be available throughout the game and needed for various puzzles by sucking up enemies or something even like fire fruits or ice beetles or something just out in the world. But at some key point, Kirby's bestowed something like a magic bag that can store the essences of each of these abilities so that you can transform and use that ability at will. And I wouldn't say that the path to these is linear either. I would love to see a really useful power be sprinkled throughout the game right from the start, but you keep having to lose it to use something else so that when you finally get that ability, long after others have been introduced and acquired, it feels really good to be able to use it whenever you want. And of course, the copy abilities lend themselves perfectly to basically dungeons. This still fits in really well to an extrapolation of the Kirby formula. Most worlds end with a boss, and their levels fairly often feel like a dungeon, depending on their aesthetic. But with the copy abilities and relying on them to solve puzzles and beat enemies, I think there's a lot more possibilities of using interesting combinations to make really unique themes. Instead of just a fire level, it's a fire and ice level, where you have to use fire sometimes, ice sometimes, but also make steam and freeze magma. Take these abilities to their logical conclusions. Kirby has so much versatility that feels like it's always touched on, but never really mined for its full potential. And this is the way I'd most love to see it happen. But will it? No, probably not. I do think that a 3D Kirby game, and one that's more ambitious than most, I'd say, is likely enough. But will they go full 3D action-adventure, puzzle platformer, Neato burrito with it? I heavily doubt it. But that's what dreams are made for. What Dreamlands are made for. Wait a minute. Kirby's Dream Land 4! But that's what I think. What do you think? Tell me about your dream Kirby game in the comments below, and if you see someone else's that you like, add on to their idea too. We love to come up with ideas for games like this that Nintendo will hopefully make, but probably won't, so check out the playlist in the end card for more just like that. And while you're down in the comments, be sure to like the video if you liked it, subscribe for more content like this every Tuesday and Thursday, and our podcast every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and now live most Fridays for supporters in the Discord. Well, that's it for me. Have a great day. Peace and blessings.